Let's go.
Began with Crimea, and everything will end with Crimea. These were the words stated.
I always feel like with videos like this, it's very, very, like, you know, like, is it... How do you know? You're a YouTuber.
On the 23rd of August last year, in making this statement, he was effectively saying two things. On the one hand, he was saying that Ukraine's current struggle against Russia
Crimea is
nearly
Ukrainian.
a decade ago, back in 2014, when the Russians initiated a much more limited invasion of Ukraine into the Crimean Peninsula, which they subsequently seized and annexed.
Watch on 1.5 speed? How about I watch it when you're banned for 10 minutes?
And Zelensky was publicly announcing that his war goals in the current
What's this music, man? This is a real-life war. I feel like I'm watching Call of Duty skill shot video. Wow, wow, wow. Hey guys, what's up, Bumbalak Chung? Ukraine taking Crimea ain't so good for a Russian, but ass, don't worry about it.
Included finally returning Crimea back to
no wonder everyone has ADHD.
Control. A goal that at the onset of the war appeared to be inconceivably optimistic. At the beginning of the invasion, most analysts expected Ukraine to collapse under the Russian boot in a matter of weeks.
Most analysts. Dude, if I learned one thing in my life, you never listen to experts. Hillary won this election, Trump can't do shit. The stock market is safe, guys. Listen to me. Ukraine is done. Ukraine is done. Ukraine. Dude, if these analysts would know anything, you know, they probably... Well, that was weird, but... You know, for example, I'm into the stock market. I care about the stock market, blah, 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 blah. And there's all these analysts, these experts. I'm a stock market expert. Here's what you should invest to. But why are you not a millionaire? Why are you not rich as fuck? No, you work in a bank for 1.8k a month. What kind of fucking analyst are you, bro? You never fucking listen to that shit.
Weeks or maybe months. The Russian army was generally considered to be the second most capable in the world after the United States. While Ukraine only possessed whatever outdated Soviet-era equipment the Russians left behind in the country following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Even resisting the Russian advance, let alone reclaiming Crimea, appeared to be a distant fantasy.
Man. Rebuilding all the shit is going to be...
Over a year into this war and far from falling apart, the Ukrainians have actually managed to push the Russians back nearly everywhere along the front line.
Very nice.
By the end of 2022, the Ukrainians had rolled the Russians back in lightning counteroffensives in the north and the south, and even managed to liberate the city of Kherson, the only regional capital of any province in Ukraine that the Russians were ever able to take over since beginning their invasion. Now, with the military momentum on their side, fresh volumes of advanced Western military equipment entering into their inventories.
The Russians aren't even the second army in Ukraine.
And the revelation of Russia as being much more of a paper tiger.
Oh, already rusted? Well, rust comes pretty fast, I guess, huh?
Than most people initially believed. The seemingly impossible goal of reclaiming Crimea a year ago suddenly appears a lot more feasible today.
I read an article that Russia is massively fortifying Crimea now. I would think that if you are the Ukrainian, if this was a HOI4 game and I would play Ukraine, I wouldn't go for Crimea. It's too predictable and it's too fortified.
But could the Ukrainians actually manage to do it? And if they did, would it finally mean an end?
So here we go, after 1 year of the Ukraine war, here is TommyKay's final... What will Tommy do in Ukraine? Here's what I will do. I just came up with this a second ago. Ukraine shits on the Russians more, gets all this shit back. Then, look, you have to peace out with Russia by giving them something. Otherwise, they're so humiliated, they're gonna fucking nuke people. They're fucking little kids, you know? You take it all back, and you give Crimea to Putin in a peace deal. But, listen to this. So he can, like, keep his head up high, right, and shit, you know, and you get the war done. Then, you fucking fortify the shit out of this, and you massively join NATO. You rush to join NATO, bro. And then you build a bulwark of anti-Putin Russia stability, man. You join NATO as fast as possible. You even get EU funding if you can, man. That's what I will do. That's what I will do.
End to the war. And what would happen
if this was a roleplay game? That's how I will do it.
Russia and Putin's regime in the Kremlin. The answers to these questions are complex.
Is that Grisha, bro? Oh no, that's the winning side. That can't be Grisha.
With a lot of potential variables to consider. Ukraine's ultimate state is complex and uncertain.
Chet, when you play Mexico in a roleplay game and you send volunteers to the USA. Guys, I support you with light tank too. Don't worry. A lot of
potential variables.
I have a light tank too.
Ukraine's ultimate stated mission at the moment is to reclaim all of their occupied lands from the Russians and restore their territorial integrity as it was prior to 2014. And that, of course, includes Crimea.
Tony, Putin will never look for Finland. I don't believe that. He utterly failed in Ukraine. Dude, Finland would annihilate his asshole, bro. Dude, I believe in that. Finland would annihilate his asshole, man. He would never touch you. I don't believe that.
Taking back Crimea will inevitably be the most challenging, dangerous,
also, they're in
and
NATO now, so that's
objective
over.
for the Ukrainians to achieve. Because Crimea...
Isn't that the artillery too from HOI4?
Plethora of reasons, is very different from all the other places within Ukraine's de jure borders that is currently under Russian occupation. And that should give the government in Kyiv a lot of pause for thought before they attempt to run into Crimea guns blazing. Let's begin with the basic realities of Crimea's geography, and how it inherently favors whomever is defending the peninsula against an external attack.
Sweden isn't in NATO yet, but very soon, I
Crimea
think.
is very nearly a completely separate island. And that makes it very difficult to get anything or anyone into it.
I think Sweden isn't yet, but it's very close.
Barely physically connected to the European mainland by this extremely narrow
What are these circles? Is that fields? Why are farmers doing circled fields? Dude, every time you look at the world, right, from like Google Maps, the whole world is fields. You never really realize that. Everything is fields. The whole world is fields, man. It's watering. It's for watering. To save water.
Isthmus, called the Isthmus of Perekop. At its widest, this isthmus is only...
I did not know Crimea is actually land connected. I did not know that.
5 kilometers across. And as the only physical entrance by
land
into Crimea, this isthmus has historically been the only possible path...
Wait, is it from the Russian side? No.
...Europe can use to march into Crimea through, without relying on boats or aircraft. This effectively transforms Perekop into a natural bottleneck, where armies advancing across it have no other choice but to tightly bunch up into dense columns in order
That's from the Ukrainian side. I didn't know that existed.
And where defenders can heavily concentrate their artillery and airstrikes in order to ensure maximum rates of destruction. Trenches, barbed wire, landmines,
naval invasion is what you need, but getting Green Navy is very hard, right?
Crimea will slowly attack
volunteers from the USA or
and
some
force
shit.
them into costly frontal assaults on well-prepared...
That's why you should not go for Crimea. I like how I'm sitting here as a white streamer idiot dude, man, who doesn't know shit. But you shouldn't go for Crimea, I think, as
positions. At the
too
same
predictable,
time,
too many
they're
losses.
Also forced into the zone of concentrated incoming artillery and airstrikes. In short, the Isthmus of Perekop is the perfect...
Damn, that's a cool AK, man. Flashlight, silencer, you got the handle. That guy's level 15 Call of Duty, man. Dude, he got the fucking camouflage skin for 50 kills. Look at him. Damn.
Perfect location for a massive killing zone. And not one that would favor the Ukrainians attacking across it. And there's only so many ways that an attacking army can get across this kill zone in order to enter Crimea.
Gear?
Across the northeast of the peninsula is this large region known as the Savash, otherwise known as the Putrid Sea. While it is covered with water, it's more like a series of extremely shallow lagoons
like
rather
Finland.
than open ocean. The average water depth across the Savash region is only between 0.5 meter and 1 meter, and during low tides, a narrow window of opportunity is granted where attacking units from the Ukrainian mainland can advance across it and flank the defenses at the rear of the Isthmus of Perekop. But this strategy carries with it a heavy risk. Once the attackers advance across the Savash
in the end, just
Crimea
don't fucking go there, I will
the
think.
high tide will inevitably come back in again afterwards and fill the Savash back up with higher water levels.
Dude, I'm so impressed how much of the world is fields. Did you ever take a plane and you flew like to Asia or the USA or some shit? The whole world is fields. You never really realize that. I think that's so interesting.
Rarely severing the
we
supply
have to
line
feed 8
between
billion
units that
fuckers,
are now
man.
in Crimea and their resupplies back over in the Ukrainian mainland. At least until the next low tide enables another crossing to take place. This provides another window of opportunity for
Everyone in history who tried to take Crimea actually took it? Oh.
the defenders on Crimea to counterattack and push the attackers back into the Savash where they can't be effectively resupplied.
Courtney actually told me there's a Crimean nation in Kaiser Redux I could play.
The only other methods available for an attacking force to break into Crimea are through either amphibious or airborne assaults on the hundreds of kilometers of Crimea's beaches. But airborne and amphibious assaults are difficult operations to pull off logistically,
Don't have
even
Green
under
Navy.
the greatest of circumstances.
Don't have Green Navy, man.
Ukraine will not have the greatest of circumstances.
Crimea and Kaiser Redux is insane. You already played that? I didn't play that. Not real. No.
They simply don't have the amphibious landing craft or the helicopters and airplanes required to establish naval and air superiority over the Black Sea. While they'll also have to contend with the literal geographic fortress that is Sevastopol, the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Even though the Russians have suffered striking...
Dude, that symbol is in Game of Thrones. You can get this symbol in the Game of Thrones housemaker.
Naval losses during this war, like the sinking of their flagship, the Moskva, the Russian naval presence in the Black Sea is still orders of magnitude greater than what the Ukrainians
have. They have no green air.
The Russians still have capable warships and submarines based out of Sevastopol, and air bases across the peninsula with more fighters than Ukraine has got. Not to even mention Russia's advanced surface-to-air missile systems bristling across the peninsula, like the S-400, that could probably shoot most of Ukraine's outdated Soviet-era fighters down. All of this effectively ensures that the Ukrainians will not be attacking into Crimea with either naval or air superiority. And that means that unless they acquire the necessary equipment from the West, any amphibious or air assault into the peninsula can be effectively ruled out.
Just paint a Russian flag on your ship. That will probably work.
Out by them. If the Ukrainians want to attack into Crimea, they're most likely going to have to attack the hard way, across the narrow isthmus of Perekop or through
Listen to TommyKay, Zelensky, don't go for Crimea, man. Don't do it. Don't fucking do it.
Essentially
here's my opinion as an expert of HOI4. You should try to encircle a lot of Russians as possible in Ukraine, do a shit ton of damage, so Russia is super fucking efficient. And then
to be transformed
see where it goes. Thank you, Zigbee. The #1 goal of Ukraine should be have a good KD. Kill as many Russians as possible without hurting your own soldiers.
Is very tough for
Please someone send that clip to Zelensky real quick.
If history serves as any guide, the Ukrainians will be in for a brutal fight to take it.
It's not
Just in recent-ish history, Crimea has been assaulted by an attacker on multiple occasions, and every time it's happened, there have been catastrophic casualties. In the 1850s, a combined force of French, British, and Ottoman troops, who greatly outnumbered the Russian defenders, attacked and besieged the port of Sevastopol. Both sides suffered over 100,000 casualties during that campaign.
Zelensky's coming to Berlin, you can tell him. Dude, one day, right, you can like connect like a cable to a HOI4 player, and then I play the Ukraine war in real life, and they just give it to me and fucking encircle, blah, 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 blah. You know?
Pain. And this was with the French and the British possessing naval superiority.
There's no safe scumming though. Careful of that. It's Iron Man mode IRL, right?
Certainly not have. During the Russian Civil War a century ago in 1920, the pro-Tsar Whites controlled Crimea, while the Reds attacked it with 4 times greater manpower from the same direction Ukraine would most likely try today. By land, with frontal assaults across the isthmus of Perekop, and a simultaneous surprise advance across the Savash that hit the Whites defending Perekop in the rear.
You will finish the campaign though.
The Reds still suffered 5 times as many casualties in this kind of attack than the defending.
How many fucking Russians died in the last 100 years in a fucking war, man?
Whites did.
How do they still have
people
people
left? The only reason why the Reds were even successful was because of their vastly higher numbers and better ability
to absorb stream snipes you?
And then, in the Second World War, the Germans and Romanians attacked into Crimea in 1941, and it took them 8 months to break through and crack into the defenses at Sevastopol. So hard were the Crimean defenses to crack that they had to bring in the infamous Schwerer Gustav to help bombard the Soviet positions.
Dude, I wonder what an impact of this fucker looks like, man. Holy shit.
To rubble. The biggest mobile artillery
my great-grandfather died there. My grandpa's dad died there. I have a grandpa who's not my blood grandpa, but I know him my whole life. Manfred, his dad died there.
History of warfare, and they still suffered over 30,000 casualties to take it over. And then, finally in 1944, the Soviets attacked into German-occupied Crimea. That time, the Soviets had the advantage of being able to attack Crimea from 2 different fronts at the same time, across the isthmus of Perekop and through the Savash in the north, and a near-simultaneous amphibious assault from the Russian mainland across the narrow Strait of Kerch in the east, an advantage that the Ukrainians of today will inherently not possess. And further, the defenses and fortification...
They can't actually take Crimea because the front line always disappears when attacking Crimea. That might be the most intelligent comment on today's stream. That was a very good comment. Thank you, Nico, my brother.
Around Sevastopol still lay in ruins from the German attack on the city that happened just 2 years previously. Another advantage that the attacking Ukrainians today will not have. The Soviets attacked into Crimea with nearly twice as many troops as the Germans and Romanians had defending it, and they had significantly more tanks and artillery brought in as well. And nonetheless, the Soviets still took 85,000 casualties in only a month of combat liberating the peninsula.
Dude, if you look at World War II Russia, right, they took so much damage and still they won. Fuck. Jesus.
Ratio of nearly 1 in 5 of the Soviet soldiers who participated
The Germans had a 5 KD, bro.
in the campaign.
Holy shit.
Based on these historical lessons, in order to overcome
How
Crimea's
did Russia win
geography
this
favoring
shit?
the
How did they
defender,
do that?
the attacking force in Crimea has always
Massive
possessed
land-leases?
either naval or air supremacy when attacking, and or a significantly larger number of troops and equipment than the defenders have. In order to overcome what will inevitably become a lopsided casualty ratio. The most similar of the historical examples to today is the one during the Russian Civil War, when the Reds attacked into Crimea only over land across the Isthmus of Perekop and through the Savage, without significant naval or air forces assisting them. They outnumbered the defending Whites 4-1, and they suffered 5 times as many casualties in order to break
Russia's entire history is we just throw manpower at a problem.
through their defenses.
It's kind of what they're doing in Ukraine, right?
To break through the Russian front lines and make it to the edge of Crimea today, they will likely face a force of at least 35,000 Russian troops.
Yeah, don't go there, Zelensky. Don't do it, man.
Historic examples of the Russian Civil War and World War II, then, the Ukrainians may want to consider attacking into Crimea.
Most of the time it seems to work.
A minimum of 70,000.
I also like how Imperial Germany is also occupying a little bit of land here.
And more ideally, 140,000 troops when the time finally comes. And they can
Doesn't
most
work that good
likely
anymore, though,
expect
as good in
tens of
World War II?
thousands of casualties,
That's
even
France?
if they end up emerging victorious. And that's assuming nothing at all goes wrong. This also isn't to say anything about the fact that, as of the production of this video, the Ukrainian army still has to actually make its way to Crimea first, before any of this can even be considered. And Geographic...
I'm sorry if I'm a retard, but you should never be this close. If I was the commander of this group, you get the fuck away from each other. 10 meters.
He is also hindering
Why am I so much better at war than everyone else?
their ability to do even that.
What are you doing?
Across October
It's
and November
training?
last year, the geography
In training, you should already instill into a soldier to always stay away from each other. It's for television, it's a parade.
in the region
Needless to
was
me.
actually working to Ukraine's benefit. The Russians occupied the
Every time I play World War II games with you guys, right, we'll always stand way too much together, man. Number one mistake.
major city of Kherson over on the west bank of the Dnipro River. But the river separated the city from Russia's major supply centers that were over on the eastern side. The only ways the Russians could resupply their garrison in Kherson by land was over this road bridge, this rail bridge, or across this other road bridge up here running across a high...
This is gonna sound very cynical, and I'm sorry to say this, but I'm kind of excited to play video games about this war, especially a Steel Division game about this, dude.
...electric dam.
This is a lot of content for video games, man.
And as their troops advanced closer to the dam, the Russians realized that Kherson was at a serious risk of becoming logistically checkmated. And so they ordered their troops to surrender the city without a fight and retreat back across to the eastern side of the Dnipro River so that they could continue fighting another day. Now, if the Ukrainians want to punch through the Kherson region towards Crimea, they are going to have to be the ones to cross over the Dnipro.
The Russians killed Nazi Germany all by themselves, world's strongest army. I think they know what they're doing. First of all, you're connecting the World War II to right now, which seems rather retarded. Also, it took Russia, how many deaths? 8 million or some shit? That was a very dumb comment, and yeah, I hope you feel ashamed about yourself.
Dnipro River and attack the
Hopefully the last mission includes a nuke.
Over on the other
25 million. 25 million people died. Yeah.
side of
all
it,
by themselves.
which will be very difficult for them.
Did we just establish it was a lot of land leasing that helped them? That was a very dumb comment. That was really fucking
retarded.
retarded.
Ukraine's best way to get at Crimea will be to concentrate on attacking through the Zaporizhia and Donetsk provinces, across the flat and open steppes in the region, and then drive towards the coastline of the
That's
Sea
what they
of
should do.
Azov.
Yeah, you do the HOI4 circumvent. When you break over that river where Dankus is always holding like a little bitch, and then BAM! Oh, that would be good. Dude, that's, yeah, this one. That would be sweet.
With the immediate objectives of liberating the cities of Melitopol, Berdyansk, and Mariupol.
That'd be
Doing
cool.
this successfully won't just place their troops closer to Crimea.
When do you think it's a start a game about this? When is it acceptable to make a video game about a war? First of all, the time you need to make a video game about a war to be morally right lowers a lot if one of them is an immoral faction. For example, Nazi Germany was fucking pure evil, right? So it's easy to make stuff about that. I also think in this world the Russians are pretty fucking evil, so maybe 10 years, maybe? Not that long, you know? Not that long. Because it's not a war between two nice guys, you know?
It'll also
There's one
sever
content in
one
this
of the
war.
primary supply arteries that
Probably
the
6
Russians are
months.
using to keep a hold
Well, people are modding, right? People are gonna mod stuff, you know?
over their position in Crimea. The so-called land bridge from the Russian mainland to Crimea through occupied Ukrainian territory. And then even further, if they manage to accomplish this, the Ukrainian troops will...
Is there any video games about the Yugoslavian war? Listen, man. 9 out of 10 Americans don't even know where Yugoslavia is, so a video game is not going to sell very well.
Then be well poised to...
Ukraine Zelensky is truly innocent, right? Nice guys, I guess. Did you get verified on Twitch for retardation? No one says that, you fuck. There's people always like you. No one says that. But I think if you want to debate or argue who has the more evil power in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, then... Bruh,
also attack west into the parts of the Kherson province still under occupation on the eastern side of the Dnipro River, without having to make a risky crossing.
No one is ever saying that Ukraine is innocent, man. But I mean, I always what is the end game of that thing? You know, Zelensky, he did bad stuff, so we should really let his country fall to Russia.
The Dnipro River itself from the west. Then, hypothetically fearing another encroaching encirclement again, the Russian troops along the Dnipro may then be forced to retreat even further back into Crimea. And only then can the Ukrainians contemplate their assault down into the peninsula. But this plan is also fraught with challenges and risks. The Russians also understand that this area is the most likely location.
Not gonna lie, HOI4 made me familiar with Europe.
For the Ukrainians to attack through next. And they are preparing for it by digging in and concentrating their new freshly recruited conscripts into the area to resist. In order to not suffer high rates of casualties by advancing across this open, flat front line to...
Well, is this armor plates? Is this when you get hit here that something cool happens? What is... You guys are all experts, right? I will guess this is some kind of armor technology. Yeah, that's ERA. Explosive reaction armor. Oh, like a rocket is coming and then this thing goes like pew, pew, and you're safe?
Words Azov. The Ukrainians need more tanks and armored personnel carriers to punch through the Russian lines.
It explodes when it hits, so it sends it away.
Which is exactly why they've been pleading with the West for months now to send them exactly that. The United States has since agreed to send them 50 Bradley armored personnel carriers and 30 M1 Abrams main battle tanks.
Wait! Oh, I didn't know that. Dude, they have a fucking skull with like a chaos symbol. That's so cool. 30 Abrams are coming? Damn. That's nice.
For this purpose, while Germany and other European allies are sending them many more Leopard 2 tanks. Once the
Deutsche Lehrbrigade, this is simple, I remember this.
Tanks for this purpose.
They were one of my sister units, Panzer Lehrbrigade.
Germany and other European allies are sending them many more Leopard 2 tanks. Once the Ukrainians feel like they have the armor that is required for this offensive.
That's why I said Ukraine is, the longer the war, the better for Ukraine, because they're getting all these tanks. Wait, what? Where was I? Sorry, I retarded. Where was I? Blah, 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 blah. What am I doing right now? Where was I? Thank you, John. I'm a fucking boomer. 1 sec. We saw this.
In order to knock off,
and then we went here. Okay.
Okay. War is never certain. If the Ukrainians fail to secure the land bridge during this offensive, they stand to permanently lose the southern chunk of their country for good, as the Russians are afforded more time to shove more freshly recruited troops and equipment into the area to beef up their defenses even further. But there's another
A train full of howitzers passed through my hometown in Italy, and we all knew where they were going. Yeah, there's often these videos where you see NATO equipment going east. That's something, you know, I always wonder about this. All you and me know is from the media. YouTube, the media, 9gag, right? But what do we not know? And something I see often is that NATO is bringing mad stuff to the east. Like, NATO isn't stupid. They are like, bro, if Russia wants to go all out, we're fucking there, bro. There's a shit ton of NATO equipment going east, man.
Major and almost hidden reason why the Ukrainians are nearly certain to try and attack along this front towards the Sea of Azov once they acquire the necessary armor coming in from the west. Ukraine understands that if they are successful here in severing Russia's land bridge, the next most obvious objective in Crimea does not favor them geographically during an attack. They could attack into Crimea, but as discussed before, they are likely to suffer tens of thousands of casualties by pushing on into it. So,
my cousin is going to Lithuania for NATO.
Bloody attack into the peninsula where the geography works against them, they could instead initiate a blockade of the peninsula where the geography works more in their favor and against the Russians. This is because just as difficult as it is to get attacking troops into Crimea, it's similarly difficult to get defending reinforcements.
Where are you guys looking? What are you doing?
As well. Right now, there's only 3 methods that the Russians can effectively use to get supplies into Crimea. The most efficient method is by using a lot of supply trucks from the Russian mainland.
Do you ever think like a real-life commander in Russia watches YouTube videos and he's like, yes, yes, I should have seen that too. I'm gonna use this tactic.
Through the occupied land bridge in Ukraine and into Crimea from the north. If Ukraine manages to sever the land bridge, that leaves the second most efficient option left for Moscow. Lower volumes of road and rail cargoes moving in across the Kerch Strait Bridge from the Russian mainland.
Is that the bridge that they destroyed?
But the Ukrainians have already...
Yeah, man, you can cut them off with the land bridge and then terrorist attack the... It's not a terrorist attack, right? Take the bridge.
Already proven themselves
and you
capable
cut off
of
Crimea
attacking this bridge and destroying sections of it. In October last year, a truck bomb blew up the road section of the bridge and made it unusable for trucks to continue carrying in supplies.
It's repaired now.
That left the rail section of the bridge still operational, but the Ukrainians could still manage to destroy that.
Yeah. You need to send like the SAS or some shit, man. The fucking Splinter Cell Sam Fisher to destroy that shit.
As well. So if the Kerch Strait Bridge gets completely knocked
offline, so man. How you doing?
And the Ukrainians advance far enough to sever Russia's land bridge in the north, then
you gotta bleed Crimea out. You gotta give them the logistic debuff.
Island again for the Russians, just like it was prior to 2018 when the Russians finished the construction of the Kerch Strait Bridge. All supplies coming into Crimea will then have to come in by the third and least efficient.
Do you think Russian generals use Putin GPT to ask for military tactics?
Option: ferries by sea and air.
Putin GPT, what can we do? You will send a drone to the roof of Kremlin, it go boom, and a guy will film with mobile phone at 3 AM, and this is false flag attack, so now we have justification to assassinate Zelensky. Ah, yes, I didn't think about this.
Aircraft by sky, both of which can be the targets of Ukrainian drones. You see, after the Russians seized and annexed Crimea back in 2014, this was how everything the Russians transported into Crimea had to come in. The Ukrainians didn't allow anything to move across their territory into another piece of their territory the Russians had just occupied, and the Kerch Strait Bridge didn't yet exist. And then to even further complicate Russia's hold over the peninsula, the Ukrainians dammed up and shut down the North Crimean Canal that delivered the overwhelming 85% of Crimea's water supply. This canal was built during the Soviet era and normally...
So taking that dam back will be very important, huh? Sounds like a Call of Duty mission, take the dam. Yes, comrade!
Supplies of water
One guy
from the
kills
Dnipro
50 people.
River in the Kherson province down into Crimea, which is otherwise
Wasn't there a mission Call of Duty 1 where you have to take a Nazi dam?
Without enough fresh water available to conduct large-scale agriculture in. After the Ukrainians shut down the canal, Crimea's whole water supply was essentially destroyed. And in just the 4 years between 2013 and 2017, the area of farmland under cultivation in the peninsula crashed by nearly 90%.
Wow.
And by
the problem with that is to make the population a bit mad, right?
2021, immediately before the invasion, Crimea was suffering from
Ukraine
widespread
already has
water
that dam.
shortages, and the Russian citizens there were only getting access to water supplies for 3 to 5 hours a day. Obviously, this situation was not sustainable for Russia's long-term hold over the peninsula, which is why they constructed the Kerch Strait Bridge in 2018 to help transport supplies in more efficiently
like
than by only
GDP.
relying on ferries. But that bridge still wasn't enough. The water canal was still blocked, and a single 2-lane highway and rail bridge can only get so many things in for 2.5 million people's needs. Thus, increasing Moscow's sustainable hold over Crimea was one of the most primary motivators for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year. On the very first day of the invasion, the Russians secured control over the entirety of the North Crimean Canal, and then just 2 days later, they blew up the dam that the Ukrainians had built to obstruct the water flow down into Crimea. The North Crimean Canal is still currently entirely within the zone of control that Russia occupies, and the water has been flowing again down into the peninsula for the first time since 2014. But if the Ukrainians move back in and sever the land bridge, they can also re-block the Crimean Canal again as well, and deprive Crimea of its precious water supply. Then, with no water, no ability to conduct large-scale agriculture, and limited abilities to send supplies into Crimea, Russia's hold over the peninsula will begin to slowly wither away, and all the Ukrainians will have to do is simply wait for something to break. Moscow in general, and Putin in particular, are each terrified of losing Crimea because of how important the peninsula, and specifically the port of Sevastopol, is to both the national security of the Russians.
I always wonder what Putin smells like. What kind of odor does he put on in the morning? I wonder what he smells like. I don't know. I think he smells like caviar. I don't know.
State, and also to Putin's own personal political power.
I think he smells like rich Swedish people. I was in this rich Swedish hotel and they all smelled the same. It's a weird smell. It's like cologne and caviar and... I don't know, it's hard to explain.
This is because Sevastopol Bay on the peninsula is without question
It's gonna smell like a
the
corpse
best natural
soon.
harbor located anywhere on the Black Sea's coastline. And for Russia, it's probably at least their second best port location they currently control
That's a lot of ships, holy shit.
anywhere. This is because Sevastopol is both a warm water port, meaning it remains ice-free year-round, and also a deep water port, meaning that the water depth there is deep enough to enable large displacement warships and submarines to safely dock there. Further, Sevastopol Bay is located almost
So if there's World War III, you just nuke Sevastopol and you took out their entire fleet, huh?
exactly in the dead center of the Black Sea, meaning that whoever controls the bay can use it to project power anywhere else in the Black Sea and dominate it. Russia's other major port in the Black Sea,
TommyKay asking for nukes now
never compete
on
with
Russia.
Sevastopol's advantages because the harbor there is smaller in size. It's shallower. There's a larger commercial port there that takes up a lot of the available
Just nuke
space
it.
away from potential warships, and it's located on the Black Sea's eastern rim, rather than the dominating position in the center
Yeah.
that Sevastopol
In the end,
offers.
man, it all
For
comes down to
hundreds
don't
of
go for
years,
Crimea, man.
he
Don't
who
do it,
controls
Zelensky, bro.
Sevastopol controls
fucking
the
do
Black
it.
Sea, and without
Do some
it,
logic is
Russia
striking,
would
man,
not
that's
only
it,
lose
you
their
know.
ability to maintain naval superiority in the Black Sea, they would also largely lose the ability to meaningfully project naval power through the Turkish Straits and into the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. This would effectively eliminate one of Russia's only major ways to project power into the world's oceans. The only other ways the geography grants the Russian state are in their ports in the
I never, why the fuck does Russia have Kaliningrad, man? Why did no one in the Cold War, when in 1991 the Soviet Union fell, why did the West not fucking be like, yeah, this goes to Lithuania, or I don't fucking know. I never get that. Why the fuck do they have that piece of land?
Baltic,
Imagine being a Russian soldier there, man. You're like, Chuckles, I'm in danger.
which are constrained by the fact that the Baltic Sea
There's too many Russians living there.
is largely a lake dominated on all of its sides by
Lithuania
NATO or
refused.
NATO soon to
No one
be.
wanted it.
Their port
Oh.
over at Vladivostok in the Far East, which is iced over for 4 months out of the year and stuck within the Sea of Japan.
Integrating Russians to a country is justifying a war goal. They tried to sell Kaliningrad. Germany refused.
Surrounded by major U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea.
Yeah, you're not gonna do
and
shit
their
in there,
only
man.
other really good port location in the far north.
I really hope that Japan remilitarizes. I think they announced that, right? Japan is becoming a military might again, which is very important to be a presence against Russian Eastern Fleet and obviously China.
To the Kola Peninsula.
Obviously, the German is asking for Japan to... But we need a strong Japan in this world,
A warm
man.
water and deep water harbor that grants
Oh
their northern
boy.
fleet
Oh
year-round
boy.
unobstructed
They put
access
400 billion
into
into
the
their
Arctic
army?
Ocean. So if they
Could
lose
be bad.
control over
Look, man, it's not
the
World War
Russian
II anymore,
Black Sea
okay?
fleet will be
A
effectively
strong Japanese
doomed.
ally would be very
Russia's only
important.
remaining good harbor
Oh, that's real life Ukraine. Look at that.
left will be Murmansk.
Another
In short,
rerun?
Russian naval power will take a massive and irrevocable L. And Russia's ability to
L.
influence
I like how this meme established itself. W's and L's.
world defense nearby, like in Syria, the Middle East,
Soviet
and North
Union proposed to give Kaliningrad to the Lithuanian Social Republic in 1960, but the Lithuanian government was afraid of being Russified with Russian settlers in Kaliningrad.
Africa will be permanently tarnished. From Russia's perspective, then,
How will Japan go to war, though, if they only have 40 to 50-year-old men? Ooh. Well, Gundams.
their calculus in this war goes into defending Crimea and keeping the peninsula stable in order for them to keep
guy in the
hanging
Pikachu
on to the
suit, man,
ports of
just-
Sevastopol. Putin's own life might even depend on it. The 2014
Sashi
annexation of Crimea and
Burinana,
the construction
Putin
of the
vara.
road and rail bridge to it are all considered the crowning achievements of his long administration in the Kremlin. The independent Levada Center polling agency found as recently as 2021 that, the year before the invasion of Ukraine, an overwhelming majority of Russians, 86% of them, supported Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. If Crimea falls back into the hands of Ukraine now, then what does Putin have to show the Russian people after paying hundreds of thousands of lives and untold amounts of treasure trying to cling onto it? This is all why to Moscow and Putin, Crimea is of a vastly higher core strategic interest than it is to Washington or even Brussels.
Japan's biggest issue is manpower shortages. Their young people are against the military. Well, it's actually time for robots then, huh?
The Kremlin is inherently
Or Japan shall make a highly quality army, very low manpower, but very high equipment, very good ships, a very sick navy, very good aircraft.
more willing
Rockets.
to gamble and take risks with escalation over Crimea than Washington is, because it is simply more important to the Kremlin than it is to the White House. And this is where the risk of Russia
Japan is not allowed to have an army. What is the legal document about that? I'm actually interested. Japan can't have army document. At present, the government interprets Article 9 to mean that Japan cannot possess Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Japan cannot possess offensive military weapons. This has been interpreted to mean that Japan cannot have ICBMs, all types of weapons of mass destruction. They are not allowed to have aircraft carriers, but they can have everything else. It has not inhibited the deployment of submarines, Aegis-equipped destroyers. They can have all that stuff. So who can destroy Article 9? Since the late 1990s, Article 9 has been the central feature of dispute over the ability of Japan to undertake multilateral military commitments overseas. During the late 80s, increases in government appropriations for the JSDF averaged more than 5% per year. By 1990, Japan was ranked third behind the then Soviet Union and the United States in total defense expansion. So they still have a big army, man. And the United States urged Japan to assume a larger share of the burden of defense of the Pacific. So USA wants Japan to go stronger. Japan has a guideline of a limit of 1% of GDP on defense spending. However, Japan defines a number of activities as non-defensive spending. Given these circumstances, some have viewed Article 9 as increasingly irrelevant. It has remained, however, an important brake on the growth of Japan's military capabilities. Despite the fading of bitter wartime memories, the general public, according to opinion, continue to show strong support for this constitutional provision. Oh, they want to keep that way. The different views can be as pacifist, etc., etc. Huh. On September 2019, Shinzo Abe, in the chat, said in the National Diet that long-range cruise missiles are not banned under Article 9. In October 2019, a senior U.S. military officer in Tokyo said that Japan's avoidance of offensive weaponry under its constitution is no longer acceptable. I would agree with that. The officer stated that Japan needs to rethink its rejection. Oh, Japan has to destroy Article 9, not anyone else. Of offensive weapons, and not that government should discuss blah, blah, blah. The officer said that the government of Japan should inform the public about the threats of China, North Korea. I very much agree with that guy. 100%. A constitutional amendment would require a 2/3 majority and pass referendum to effect. Despite numerous attempts, they tried to change that. They have never been able to achieve the majority. Because it's being opposed by the DPJ and the Japanese Communist Party. Huh. They can't get rid of Article 9 then. Because they can't get the majority. They will need something bad happening, like North Korea going a bit ham. That's what happens when you fight the US. We beat you so bad you become a pacifist. I mean, it might have been the 2 nukes. I'm very excited for the Oppenheimer movie, where Oppenheimer makes the nuke. That's going to be a sick movie.
Their threats and red lines come into play when discussing any Ukrainian attack into Crimea. Because the peninsula is so geopolitically valuable to Russia, there is a risk, no matter how small, that if faced with losing it militarily to the Ukrainians, the Kremlin may decide it would be worth the risk and escalation to deploy a weapon of mass destruction in order
looks
to
like a
avert
video
the
game,
outcome.
bro.
Either chemical weapons or a smaller yield tactical nuclear device. This risk is why the United States and Ukraine's other Western partners have so far declined to give them longer range missiles or fighter jets that they could hypothetically...
Man, that fucking nuke shit. If there was just some technology that captures nukes. Like you have a nuke, but there's this technology. It's like a little drone. And the drone makes a bubble around the nuke and just keeps it all together, man, and then puts it into, I don't know, fucking into Oklahoma or some shit, you know?
Used to help assist them in a campaign to take back Crimea. But obviously,
a big
even
net.
if Crimea
Yeah, a
isn't
big
as
net.
important to Washington as it is to Moscow, it is certainly just as important to Kiev.
I always wonder what the world would look like without nukes. I generally think that this war will not be a thing right now, right?
If not even more so. The peninsula served as the Russian army's most important staging ground leading up to the 2022 invasion.
Dude, these
Moscow
pictures
was
are
able to
public,
concentrate
man. Isn't that
tens
crazy?
of thousands of troops in a fortress immediately to the south of Ukraine's mainland, bristling with naval and air bases and support
There will be much more war. Yeah,
Moscow's
nukes are kind of
control
good because people are not going
over
crazy all the
Crimea
time.
is
Yeah.
the most major factor.
But then you have a problem where a madman like Putin has a nuke right now,
explaining
right?
why the Russian invasion in the south of Ukraine turned out to be much more successful and longer lasting than it was anywhere else. So long as Crimea remains under the control of the Kremlin, then, Ukraine's security will never feel secure. If this current war ends with Moscow still keeping Crimea and Putin still staying in power, there is all
Man, he's using so much Botox, man.
risk from Kiev's
He really wants to remain looking strong.
perspective that a few more years down the road, the Russians will just lick their wounds and recover, and then come back from Crimea again better prepared than they were in 2022. A peace with Russia retaining Crimea would be an uneasy peace for Ukraine, while a peace with Ukraine reclaiming Crimea would be catastrophic for Russia.
That's the thing. I don't want to sound anti-Ukrainian, man, but you take your land back, but you don't take Crimea back. You give it to Putin, he can save his face, and you just prepare yourself. You join NATO, man, you build mad defenses, you prepare yourself hard.
Russia's
That seems like
aspirations
a good outcome. This is why we need Homelander.
And this is precisely
Imagine Homelander going to Ukraine. You guys are the real heroes. Let me just take care of these Russians real quick.
why neither side, for the moment, is willing to negotiate on anything resembling a peace. The stakes are just too high, and neither side is yet exhausted fighting. But okay, let's say that just for
Obviously, I would like to see Crimea under Ukraine, but
the sake of the
gotta be-
hypothetical, the Ukrainians
if it's so
actually do
fucking
manage
defended, how the
against
fuck do you
all odds
take
to
it, man?
attack into Crimea, take it back successfully,
Yeah, we'll never
and
join
avoid
NATO.
a
We're
Russian
talking the
nuclear
next decades, maybe.
retaliation. What will end up happening next? This question gets us into the next part of what makes Crimea
I always wonder, you know, you and me were young, we're 20 to 30, right? I wonder what Russia will look like when Putin is dead. He's old, right? He's gonna maybe make 10 more years or some shit, if he's lucky. I wonder what happens then. Who's gonna take over? I hope it's not that Medvedev? He seems like a retard. That Medvedev guy, they will have a lot of infighting, I would think. They will have a lot of fight. But that Medvedev guy seems retarded, man. Every time I see clips of that guy seems like a straight up retard. Like straight up, he's a bit fucked in the head.
so completely different from all the other parts of Russian-occupied Ukraine that Kiev has
Navalny.
so far successfully taken back.
The world kind of forgot about
Crimea's
Navalny.
demographics. The uncomfortable truth is that right now, Crimea is a majority ethnically Russian area, and probably a very
And not a great argument why maybe you shouldn't involve Crimea, maybe.
pro-Russian territory as well. Because you see, Crimea has a very long history of demographic manipulation coming in from Moscow. During the Second World War, Stalin ordered the deportation of hundreds of thousands of the peninsula's indigenous
Russia likes doing that. They take people from somewhere and just purge them and get them the fuck out.
Tatar people.
They like doing that.
And hundreds of
I mean, you know, my great-great-grandfather did that too.
thousands of Russians moved in to replace them. Thus, Russians have been the ethnic majority in Crimea
Clever, though.
ever since 1944. Then, a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine conducted an official census in 2001 that found that around 60% of Crimea's population were ethnic Russians, compared to only 24% Ukrainians and 10% Tatars. Because of this, Crimea was always the most pro-Russian part of Ukraine for decades before the 2014 annexation. In 1991,
That's the kid that tell you. That's the guys who tell you to rush being Counter-Strike or go mid in League of Legends and Dota.
Russian part
That's
of
how they
Ukraine
look like.
for decades before the 2014 annexation. In 1991, an overwhelming 94% of Crimean voters voted during a referendum to become their own autonomous republic within the Soviet Union, which would have
That would be a good outcome that Putin will never accept. Nobody gets Crimea. Crimea becomes its own state. That's an interesting outcome, but they will be massively influenced, right? Like the West and Russia will go ham on propaganda there, man.
have separated them from the Ukrainian SSR. And then 3 years later, in 1994, another overwhelming 83% of Crimean voters
Crimeans don't want that. Can you read?
supported allowing themselves dual Russian-Ukrainian citizenship. Crimea also
Day one
consistently
civil
voted
war.
heavily in every Ukrainian presidential election for pro-Moscow candidates over pro-EU ones. But even though Crimean voters generally supported measures that would give their peninsula autonomy and closer relations with Russia, it didn't necessarily mean that they wanted to completely join Russia outright. This can be seen through votes like in December 1991. Wherein a slim majority of 54% of Crimeans voted for an independent Ukraine, albeit under the condition of Crimea's local autonomy from the government in Kiev. And then, in 2010, a local Crimean party running on a platform for unification with Russia received only 4% of the peninsula's vote.
Holy shit.
Although, to be fair, that election
Didn't Putin do a fake vote there? And it was like 99% want to be, this is like Austria and Germany, don't worry.
was held at the time when the
But yeah, Russia holding referendum.
very pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych
It's like banning all of chat, keeping fucking Cosma in here and saying, who wants to suck my dick?
was serving as Ukraine's president, and relations between Ukraine and Russia were very
103%.
warm. Now, over the past 9 years since the Russians invaded and annexed Crimea, the demographic situation on the
these
peninsula
retards,
is
bro.
only
But the literal orcs, that's Grunt. You're literally Mordor. That's how you break open the fucking doors. Dude.
shifted further towards Moscow's favor. It's likely that tens of thousands of pro-Ukrainian Crimean residents have either left, been forcibly expelled, or arrested
That's also a thing. Russia is probably really fucking up everyone who's pro-Ukrainian right now.
over the past 9 years. While at the
Yeah,
same time,
so Crimea
the
is
Russian
probably
state
really hard to hold.
encouraged the migration of anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million
Russia's
Russian
very clever with that shit. They're very clever with
citizens
that.
from the Russian
That's...
mainland to the peninsula following the
As I
annexation.
always said, Russia sucks militarily right now, but Russia is very good with propaganda, spy actions, and this kind of shit, man.
This demographic
influence shit.
engineering
They're very good
in
with that
Crimea
stuff.
has almost certainly shifted the peninsula towards being even more pro-Russian than it had even been beforehand. Ultimately meaning that if
How do you
Ukrainian
unroot that,
troops
man?
come
It's
marching
almost
into
impossible.
Crimean cities, they may not necessarily be welcomed as liberators by everyone, like they have been everywhere
Don't go
else.
to Crimea, I will
For
think,
the first
man.
time in this war,
Don't do it.
it might be the Ukrainian army that has to face a partisan resistance
Yeah, don't
and
do
a
it.
simmering
Don't do it.
insurgency against them. And so that begs what is perhaps
It's
the
not worth it
biggest
yet.
question surrounding Crimea's future of all. If and when the Ukrainians retake Crimea, what will happen to all of these Russians on the peninsula who moved there since Moscow annexed it? Senior Ukrainian government officials have already promised amnesty from
What time is 8 p.m. in US Central? Use Google, you fuck.
criminal prosecution for Crimean residents who collaborated with Russia. But that amnesty only applies
The guy has a Soviet flag.
to the residents of the peninsula who were there before.
It's like in
the
Germany when they
Russians
have the
annexed it in
Imperial German
2014.
flag.
For the 500,000 to 1 million Russian citizens who have relocated to Crimea since 2014, they will most likely be afforded no such legal protections. In order to squash the resistance and the insurgency and return Crimea back to how it was before 2014, will the Ukrainians really forcefully deport up to 1 million people from the peninsula and push them all back into Russia? If they do, it will inevitably generate massive amounts of hardship and suffering for a lot of people that will be very visible, which will inevitably become a huge propaganda defeat for Ukraine and opportunity for Moscow. That could encourage
I really agree with this video,
heavier
man.
resistance
Crimea
among the
is a
Russians in
very
Crimea who are affected.
not so good subject for
Regardless
Ukraine.
of the ethics of Russia's conduct in occupying Crimea,
Look at these people, man. That's what you do with your life if you have an IQ of 80, bro. Right here. Straight up.
9 years.
The fucking
Fact
retarded,
is
bro.
that in order to change the reality back to what it was like prior to 2014, the Ukrainians will now have to forcefully deport at least hundreds of thousands of people in the largest population transfer seen on the European continent since the Second World War. It's a bad choice that Russia has really given them no other option in choosing. Ultimately then, because of how costly in lives it will likely become for Ukraine to assault Crimea, the risks of Russia resorting to chemical or nuclear escalation, the likely partisan resistance on the peninsula, and the
Russia is really fucking up everyone pro-Ukrainian in their occupied territories. What are you sending me here? This 16-year-old boy is in Yalta on Crimea. And he says, I'm for Ukraine. And he had to apologize. He said he's pro-Ukraine and he had to apologize or some shit. Okay. At least he had the fucking boats.
bad optics that will come with forcefully deporting up to 1 million people. It may just be a wiser decision for the Ukrainians to only make Russia fear losing Crimea than for them to actually
this
try
video
to
is very...
keep it.
I fully agree with
By
this video.
advancing across Zaporizhia and
And
Kherson, the
me
Ukrainians
agreeing
can
is very important,
sever
right?
Russia's land bridge to Crimea and re-shut the Crimean Canal. And by combining that with blowing up the Kerch Strait Bridge for good, the Ukrainians can
You should
signal
just
that
logistically
Moscow's
bleed
hold
Crimea.
over Crimea is vulnerable, and then put the peninsula to siege. Then, fearful of losing the peninsula and the all-important base at Sevastopol, the Russians and Putin himself would likely be more heavily incentivized to enter into negotiations in order to spare themselves from
The problem with autocrats like Hitler and Putin is they will never give up. They will... It's very, very hard to get them to the talking table,
losing
right?
Crimea.
Almost
Rather
impossible.
than attacking into Crimea with all of the likely negatives, Ukraine can then enter into negotiations with Moscow.
I wonder how often he sees his family, right? His wife and kids, they went west. Where are they right now? Actually, that's a weird question, right? But where's his family? He hasn't probably... I wonder how often he sees his family. That must be very hard for him, man.
With the upper hand, which as far as I can see, could lead to 3 possible scenarios. 1. Crimea returns
Nobody knows, probably you say.
to Ukraine
Let's leak it live on stream.
diplomatically alongside the rest of Ukraine's occupied
It's a
territories,
secret. It's probably good
which
like that.
is difficult, if not impossible, for Putin and Russia's current government to agree to, and is therefore likely to encourage further escalation and fighting unless Putin is somehow removed from power, and a more sympathetic government in the
Thank you,
Kremlin
Ralphin.
replaces him. 2. Russia surrenders all of its occupied territories in Ukraine
Never
except
gonna happen.
for Crimea, which is difficult for Ukraine to agree to because of the associated security risks and the chance of Russia just coming back for another go at Ukraine.
But another go, you're more prepared, and you... I mean, would you have more Western support? Because the West is so pussy in all this shit, right? Oh, we're gonna give you, like, 5,000 helmets and maybe some tanks.
In the future.
You can't trust the West so much if you're Ukraine, right? The West is so full of pussies and pro-Russian German chancellors.
All of its occupied land in Ukraine.
Today there was a court case in Germany where former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder has sued in Germany to get his office back. As a former chancellor, you're allowed by law to own an office in Germany that's paid for by the taxpayer. And he was suing to get the office back. He lost, though, luckily. Imagine the German taxpayer would have to pay for his fucking office, man, while he is working for Gazprom. Puh, Junge. Puh. Nie wieder SPD, Dreckspack, Junge. The biggest fucking traitor of the German people since World War II.
And
that motherfucker, man. He's let's not even fucking go there, man.
Independent and demilitarized country, separate from both Moscow and Kiev. UN peacekeepers are deployed to the peninsula to keep it out of both sides' control. Ukraine agrees to keep the water flowing through the Crimean Canal, and no military presence on the...
They even tried to kick Gerhard Schröder out of the SPD, the current leading part of Germany, but it's against the law. They can't kick him out.
Peninsula other than the UN peacekeepers is
fucking
allowed
joke.
whatsoever.
Disgrace.
Perhaps this independent Crimean state is still able to grant the Russians a lease to the naval facilities at Sevastopol so that the Black Sea Fleet can continue using it. But no other bases of any kind are permitted anywhere beyond it. That way, Ukraine gets its security dilemma mostly resolved by removing the Russian army and air force from Crimea, while their territorial integrity gets mostly restored at the same time.
White
while
peace
Russia
scenario.
gets to maintain their Black Sea Fleet headquarters at Sevastopol, which is what they mostly want out of Crimea.
Why is it against law? I don't know the details. If you want to kick a person out of a party, then I don't know. I have no idea about that shit. There's certain laws, but I don't know. But they can kick him out of the party for some reason.
You should both be aware that there are never any easy answers or solutions to war. Wars begin in the first place due to a failure of diplomacy and a clash of core interests that cannot be reconciled. Ukraine and Russia alike face hard choices ahead of them, and there is no choice that will solve everything and keep everyone happy. Crimea's ultimate future,
complex.
and the futures of the
Many people on Twitter don't like to hear that.
people who live there, for the moment, remains uncertain. As Zelensky said months ago, everything
Do you think if Russia uses a nuke, the West should respond with using force? That's a very, very whatever question, you know, that's really... We're talking about a nuke being used here, which is kind of fucked up to think about. But if Russia nukes, like, Kiev, then the West has to do something, right? But you know what I think? This is what I believe the world looks like. From books and movies and shit like that. I think that countries around the world, Israel, Russia, China, EU not so much, and USA, what they do is they have a network of spies that are connected. Like, for example, there's a spy network in Russia and the CIA, and they talk to each other. They know each other for many years. They're like, hey, what's going on? Hey, let's make sure nobody's using nukes and stuff like that, right? I think there's always agents talking to each other. And I would think that the entire agent network of the world is really working on Russia never doing this shit, you know? Not Illuminati, you know what I mean? Like, spy networks talk to each other, you know? That's very normal, that CIA spies have contacts to Russian spies, and they talk about stuff. Hey, are we cool here? What are we doing here? You know, that's totally gonna happen. That is totally a thing. That's a very insane claim. That's the most normal thing in the world, you retard. Spy networks have connections, and they have contacts, and they talk about shit. And I would think they're making sure that there ain't no fucking nukes dropping, man.
Began with Crimea, and everything will eventually end with Crimea. Now, the macro objectives of nations...
What's your opinion on Navalny? I don't know shit about that guy. I have no idea.